Here we are talking about organized labor, or what we might call unions and collective bargaining. So what is a union? Well, a union is an opportunity for employees to come together and bargain for better wages and better working conditions collectively. So when we think about a single employee coming to an employer to negotiate, that employee might have very little negotiating power. One, they might be very easily replaced. They might have concerns that the employer may not think are widespread among all the employees. And so by coming together with employees and bargaining collectively, what we call collective bargaining, or coming together to negotiate as a single body to the employer, grants the employees more negotiating power. And now why this is important is because there are certain industries that have a single employer. We call these monopsonies. As a result, there is very strong negotiating power by that employer, because if the employees don't work for that employer, there's no other place to work. So think of the historic factory towns, that the employer is the only employer in town, the factory is. And so if you get fired from there, there's no other place in that town that you can work. And so by having a single employer, it really disadvantages the employees in terms of job characteristics and intends a better job. And so by collectively bargaining, it gives the employees equal, if not almost equal, power with the employer. And so that's what we call. So if you watch the movie Newsies, I really encourage you watch this movie. It's on Disney Plus. We won't watch it right now. But this is a fictional depiction of the newsboy strike of 1899. But it really goes to show the different ways in which unions are used to try to gain negotiating power. So when Jack Kelly goes to visit Spot Collins in Brooklyn, they're trying to bring together all the newsboy workers to form a collective whole. And then when the newspaper hires scabs or individuals that sell newspapers during the strike, that's something that employers try to do, is hire replacement workers. So they fight, and there's all these altercations and strong arm tactics. These were all used historically, and it's really depicted very well here in the movie Newsies. So it's on Disney Plus. I'd encourage you, check it out as soon as you can. In 1935, they passed what was called the National Labor Relations Act, and this establishes a board that formulates laws and rules governing collective bargaining. So it gives the right of labor to organize and to form unions. You can't fire someone now for trying to form a union, and it gives them protections during strikes, during picketing, and other such things, but it also is the conflict resolution body. So when you're in a union and there's a conflict between the workers and the employer, that goes to the National Labor Relations Board and not through court systems. And so the reason why this is important is when we talk about some collective bargaining agreements, using the sports leagues is a really interesting example. Now, they're not as historic as the Carnegie steel mill riots, but here are some examples in sports. So a collective bargaining agreement is between the players, the player association, that's their union, and the owners. And the commissioner is a representative of the owners. And so a collective bargaining agreement is going to determine how much of league revenues goes towards salaries. Are they going to put mins and maxes on different players' salaries, and different structures within the organization. And so we look historically, is Major League Baseball had the reserve clause. And so the reserve clause meant at the end of your contract, the team could reserve your services for an additional year. So if you signed a 3-year contract, you can then, the team could say, well, we don't want you to go to free agency where you can test and try to get a higher salary, is we can reserve you for a year with a slight increase of last year's salary. And so good players would never actually reach free agency because of this reserve clause. It could be used over and over again. And so some of the best players never went to free agency. A player like Mickey Mantle, like you see here, only changes teams when he's traded or, in his case, sold for $1 million from the Kansas City Athletics to the New York. Curt Flood is a famous example in the 1960s. He helped the Cardinals win 2 World Series. After a poor performance, he was traded to the Philadelphia Phillies. Now, previous times playing in Philadelphia as an opposing team, he was called by racist names. They threw batteries at him. He did not want to go to Philadelphia. And because he was not given free agency, he was traded. And so he actually filed a lawsuit, Flood v. Kuhn, that made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. And this law was contesting the reserve clause. But the Supreme Court ruled that Major League Baseball is antitrust exempt because of a previous Supreme Court ruling in 1915. But more importantly, it reiterated and focused that issues with collective bargaining need to be resolved by the National Labor Relations Board. And so in the early 1980s, there was a lot of evidence of collusion among owners. So this is a picture of Carlton Fisk. He played for the White Sox, an all-star catcher. He signed an agreement with the New York Yankees as a free agent. But the White Sox owner called the Yankees and asked them to void the contract because they wanted to re-sign Carlton Fisk. And so the Yankees did. As a result, Carlton Fisk didn't have any outside offers. His salary went lower. At this time in the early 80s, team revenues were increasing, but player salaries were decreasing. Owners were exploiting the workers in this case. In 1987, the owners admit to collusion through National Labor Relations Board, and they're fined $280 million. And so this continues all the way through 1994. And that's where the players go on strike. They want to strike to try to gain negotiating power to improve the situation in terms of the collective bargaining agreement. Now, in Major League Baseball, there's only one employer. It's a monopsony. And so that's where the players banded together to try to negotiate a better collective bargaining agreement. The World Series was canceled. Spring training in 1995 was canceled. Eventually, they solved their issues, and it's not until 2003 that a new collective bargaining agreement is established, which grants the new rules of free agency. And since then, baseball's gone without any major labor disputes. The NFL is another interesting case. So here's Walter Payton. At one point, he was the all-time leading rusher. After 1981, here's statistics. One of the best rushers and running backs in the NFL, he received 0 free agency offers. And so he was forced to re-sign with the Chicago Bears. He helps them win the 1985 Super Bowl. But as a result of this and other examples, the NFL players go on strike in 1982. They wanted a higher percentage of league revenues to be dedicated towards player salaries. By going on strike, they were hoping to gain bargaining power. Now, when you're trying to gain bargaining power, it's really important to think about what are the tools that the union has. So strikes are one of the tools. And so they use the strike, but when you're not working, when you're on strike, that actually reduces the revenues of the league, of the owners, and that's the key. But it also reduces the income of the players. And so to try to show their ability to have a strong negotiating position, they held an all-star game that they were hoping would sell out, they'd get lots of money, and that this would give them money to hold them over during the strike and give them negotiating power. Unfortunately, both of these All-Star games were complete busts, and it strengthens the power of the owners, and eventually they reach a resolution and they return to work. And they return to work for a couple years. In 1987, they go on strike again, this time focused specifically on free agency. But because of the negotiating power of the union, they weren't as strong. So the union didn't have funds to pay the workers during the strike. So the players were without money. So many of the players crossed the picket line and worked because the owners hired replacement players. Sean Payton, the coach of the New Orleans Saints today, was the starting quarterback for the Chicago Bears. He crossed the picket line and was willing to play. And the owners did this. They hired the replacement players because if they could put on games, they would still receive the TV revenue, which vastly strengthened their position. So the players, as a result, again, an unsuccessful strike, so they returned to go to work with the owners in a very strong position. So the players actually did something very interesting. They disbanded the union. They became non-union employees. And to do this, here's a picture of Reggie White, the defensive end for the Philadelphia Eagles. They did this because if you're not a union, you can resolve disputes through the court system. And so they filed multiple lawsuits again for free agency and for other issues. These are then resolved in the courts in favor of the players. And by 1993, the players reorganized the union with these now new rules of free agency. And so that's some examples of what unions have done historically in the sports context that really help us understand the formation of unions at the turn of the century in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So where are unions today? So this is a statement from President Joe Biden. This is made when he was on the campaign trail in 2020. And he said, strong unions built the great American middle class. Everything that defines what it means to live a good life, and know you can take care of your family. The 40-hour work week, paid leave, healthcare protections, a voice in your workplace. All of those are things that the unions brought to us and are available to us today because of unions. Because of organizing and collective bargaining, there used to be a basic bargain between workers and their employers in this country, that when you work hard, you share in the prosperity of your work you created. And so that is the key, is President Biden is very strong in unions, but unions have not had the place in American society as much lately. Now, they're very strong when there's occupations with a single employer, school teachers. Here in Cedar City, there's only one employer for school teachers, Iron County School District. And so in those cases, teachers unionize to try to gain negotiating power. You see it with government jobs and other factories or with specialized skill sets, professional athletes, where there's a single employer. That's a really big industry where unions can be very effective because they give negotiating power to workers that may not have it otherwise. Now, in jobs that may have a lot of employers, so think of fast food in Cedar City. There's a lot of fast food restaurants. So therefore, if you try to unionize at a single place, then they'll just fire you and they'll hire other fast food workers because you're easily replaced. And so not every industry will benefit from a union, but some will. And here is President Joe Biden talking about his support of the impact unions have had on the country and the impact they could currently have on the country.